Up next, we have Nick Thornburg from NREL.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nick Thornburg, and I'm a chemical reaction engineer at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Today, I'm going to be telling you about this fuzzy little thing called lignin, which happens to be a key component of plants and a reason why biofuels have not really progressed a lot in the last 40 years. At these kind of switch events, we hear a lot about things like wind and solar and Elon Musk trying pot for the first time, and all these kind of things sort of leave out this sore thumb of a subject called biofuels. And why is that? Well, it turns out there's a lot of reasons why, not just the political consequences of trying to deal with, say, lobbyists from oil companies, but there's a lot of significant economic and scientific challenges. Some of you may be familiar with things like cellulosic ethanol that turned out to be massive failures at the economic scale, even though they were elegant concepts inside of the lab. So to unpack that a little bit, let's just first think about the business model. You're selling an expensive fuel for cheap. Tends to be a bad way to start up a company. It also turns out that plants themselves are really complicated, and there's this thing called lignin inside of all plants that gets in the way of our ability to make biofuels. This cartoon is from 1993, and we're still sort of just about here with what we understand about lignin. It's sort of this glue that holds the cell wall together, but unfortunately it gets in the way of the meat of the plant, which is the type of stuff we'd like to turn into a biofuel. And so if we look across different species of plants, say trees, grasses, agricultural wastes, these kinds of things, there's different amounts of lignin, but also different types of lignin. And this is a really complex problem. Even at our best attempts to try and control this, say looking at two trees in a forest right next to each other of identical age and species, there are billions and billions of versions of lignin at a molecular level that are different from one another. And that's a really difficult problem to try and unpack from an engineering standpoint, especially if we're trying to think globally about this. And so let's dive into this a little bit more. The key saying in the Department of Energy is you can make anything out of lignin except money. And the reason why is because it has this beautiful chemical architecture that's really hard to break down in an effective way. And the paper industry knows this quite well because they've had to sadly burn or landfill most of the lignin that they take out of wood. And so rethinking this concept of a biorefinery, we have to do better than paper. We can't treat lignin as a waste anymore. We need to use every carbon atom in that tree. And ideally, the lignin is going to be something that we can make money with. And so thinking past fuels, we take a little inspiration from the petrochemical industry, where 15% of every barrel of oil is this thing called petrochemicals. They're building blocks to making consumer products that we buy off the shelf every day. And it turns out that that's actually where most of the money is when you look at the profits of these kind of companies. And rethinking our concept of biorefineries, we have to be thinking of taking lignin as a precursor for making these important chemicals instead of petroleum, and using that in a business sense to self-subsidize the cost of an expensive fuel down the road. And so the way our research group attacks this is first by looking at molecular mimics of lignin that help us identify sound approaches. We try and study the chemistry and physics of the wood itself, and then we build actual equipment in the lab to try and break this down and build a process that's commercializable. The lignin model compound research that I was alluding to is sort of like organic chemistry on steroids. This is actually a simple lignin model molecule, and you can see all the different complex reactions it can undergo where we try and break and rearrange bonds in the molecule. But understanding this helps us get to the real stuff. When you look at plant tissues, say from a hardwood tree, you see this beautiful complexity that Mother Nature's created for us, and how the lignin is sort of this bright orange strand that runs across the middle of adjacent plant cells. And so we have to get in there and develop some technology to extract the lignin out of that. But we can use things like supercomputers to help us build 3D models of biomass particles that we can then immerse in chemical environments and come up with better ways of turning the knobs in the lab. Meanwhile, back in the lab, we can build things like the next generation of biorefineries, where we can basically take lumps of sawdust and break them down and turn them into valuable chemicals. This is sort of like a blueprint for where we hope to be in 20 years as a society. Unfortunately, though, as exciting as all this sounds, there's still a lot of limitations. Turns out that any approach to trying to break down lignin leads to a really complex soup of chemical products. And that's a really dangerous place to be in if we're thinking about, say, chemical manufacturing, where product purity is a really, really important thing to value. And so we can use things like advanced biology to help funnel this complexity down into things that are more targeted, and then use traditional engineering to build it back up into consumer products. In short, lignin is an incredibly freakishly complex problem, but one that we have a better ability to break down now that we understand it better. And once we crack open a tree, we're going to get all sorts of different size and shape Legos that we never had access to before. And this is going to lead to a renaissance in the way that we make chemicals and pharmaceutical drugs. With that, I'd like to thank the Bioenergy Technologies Office for funding this work, and our research group's fantastic leader, Dr. Greg Beckham. Many thanks to the Switch team as well for putting on this event tonight, and for all of you for your time and attention. Thank you.